Thanks, Howard. I know we want to get started. To get started, I will say that today's format is going to be different. Normally we have a speaker and a panel, and you all sit there and kind of listen. We expect you to stand up and talk. Lynn is going to be roaming the crowds. We have the people from the individual towns right at the front. They're going to respond to what Lynn has to say. But all of you got invited because you're all smart and you know this stuff. So we expect you to interact too. I'm going to be roaming around with a microphone too. So without further ado, and because I can't find the last page of my thing, let me introduce the very, very talented Lynn Richards. It's great that she came up here. We're lucky to have her. So Lynn, it's all yours.
So David's right, we're going to do things a little bit different. We're really going to engage you. But I first want to say thank you. If I was in your shoes, it's kind of scary bringing in an outsider from Washington, no less, right? To come in and to say, hey, how can we do things differently? So how can we really begin to leverage this $1.5 billion investment that your state is making in transportation? How can we evolve our town to create and to recapture the greatness of Connecticut? So I want to start off a little bit by just showing you some things, and you already know this. This is West Hartford. This is Essex, river towns. You have an amazing coastal resources, New Canaan. There's so many examples across Connecticut of where you really got the development right that I didn't know where to choose. So one of the things that we want to do now, before we get started, is I want to hear from all of you about what do you want for Connecticut? Where and how do you want to live? So this is the interactive part. You've had your coffee, whatnot. So let's start talking. Just stand up and we'll start calling out. Where and how do you want to live? What do you want for your state? What do you want for your children? What do you want for your grandparents, for your parents?
Hi, I'm Kathy Null from Bridgewater, Connecticut, and I'm really excited to be here to listen to what you have to say about Windsor Locks, Wallingford, Newington, and Clinton. But I live on the Route 7 corridor in Bridgewater, a town of 1,800 people.
Ma'am, what we're trying to do is get like 10 or 15 people just to stand up and to say what they want to live. So are you going to give me a comment, or are you...
Yeah, I'd like to know, I'd like to stay where I am in a small town on Route 7. So yes, as a 68-year-old woman, I'd like to know how we can improve our town.
Okay,
because it's about 1,800 people.
So for you, you want to stay in a small town.
I want to stay in a small town.
Keep the small town atmosphere.
Exactly.
Oh, that's excellent. Andy?
Well, as I'm Andy Brecker, and before I leave the Congo line, what I'm interested in is having my kids think that coming back from San Francisco and Cambridge, Mass. To live in Connecticut would be hip and cool.
Hip and cool. So we want to stay in the small town and hip and cool. Okay? Yes, ma'am.
I would like to be able to get out of my car and be able to safely ride a bike, walk, or take mass transit where I need to go.
Transportation choice. Excellent. Yes, ma'am.
I want to live in a town that I can walk to everything, the library, the train station, and then if I want to take a bike or walk further beyond that, just like Switzerland, I can walk, find a trail and go for a walk without ever getting in my car.
I just met a man who walked across America, spent 8 months, and he just talks about walking as almost meditation in his experience that he does every morning. So walking, yes, ma'am.
I want kids to have a reason to go outside and play.
Free range kids. We want free range kids. All right. Anyone else? Anyone else? And you guys up in the balconies, you can just stand up and
scream.
Yeah.
I'm married almost a year now, and I have kids. I don't want to have to put them in the car to bring them to every play date, every outing with their friends, every soccer game, everything. So I can walk up with them.
I have a 11-year-old. Our tandem is a family station wagon. Yeah. But you know what? Yeah, this was great and terrific. And I asked David before we started, for him to talk with just a few of the commissioners, some of his board members, to say, what do the leaders, your state leaders, want for Connecticut? And what you'll see is that it's not altogether different from what you all said, right? We want to create a place where we can put housing near our transportation investments, right? So we create that walkability. We want to be able to maintain the culture of the small town, right? We want to be able to have our kids to go out and play. That these values are not altogether different from what you all said. And you know what else is really, really cool about everything that we just said? It creates economic development, right? I mean, think about that. How many local government officials do we have, whether elected or not? How many folks work in local government here today? Okay, that's quite a bit. How many of you have money coming out of your ears? You don't have any problem with that. All right, let the record show that nobody raised their hand. So guess what? I'm about to give you a whole bunch of free advice. You want to figure out how to increase your property tax rolls. You want to figure out how to increase your revenue. You want to figure out how to spend less money on infrastructure. You want to figure out how to invest in place. You want to leverage that $1.5 billion, right? Because what we find is that placemaking creates value. These are statistics. I'm not going to read them. You all can read them. But what we have found is that many local governments are turning to placemaking now as an economic development strategy. As a country, at the federal, state, and local level, the era of single objective spending is over. We can no longer afford to spend money to achieve only one outcome. The state of Connecticut cannot afford to spend that $1.5 billion to achieve transportation change. They can't. That's just one outcome. We need to use that. You all need to use that investment to really begin to invest in place, to put more housing by those transportation stops, to really look at your streets, to how to foster and protect and celebrate the pedestrian, how to create those connections, right? Because that's where we're leading as a country. And again, these are examples. You all can read them. This is a leave behind. But you get a sense. You get a sense of how local governments are using placemaking as an economic development strategy. I particularly like the Chelmsford, Massachusetts example. Is anyone here from Chelmsford? Yeah. Okay. So, but what they did is that they didn't particularly want to do any of this placemaking. They wanted to maintain the small town atmosphere, right? But what they found is that when they began to identify and to celebrate their small town, their downtown, when they began to reinvest in place, that their whole downtown sprung to life again. Oh, and by the way, there was a 25% bump in their tax revenues. But what all of these economic development strategies have in common, and it goes back to, I think, what every single commissioner touched on, is that they're all walkable. You think about common characteristics when you start talking about transit-oriented development, when you start talking about how to achieve this vision, which is incredibly nuanced, right? It all comes back down to the pedestrian. So what is it that you need to do to begin to celebrate and protect the pedestrian? Or as I like to say, put people first. When you think about how you're going to, where's Newington? Right here. When you're thinking about how to look at the Cedar Street station or the Newington Juncture, how are you going to put people first? How are you going to make it that a pedestrian is more important in that neighborhood than a car? When you think about Clinton, how are you going to make it where it's easy for pedestrians to access all of the natural resources that you have to offer? Right? Put people first, and that's really what we're saying. And again, this is free economic development advice. When you put people first, when you create walkable communities, it has a very positive impact on your revenue. Not only property values, higher retail sales, but also higher revenue. So this is work that Joe Minicosi out of North Carolina did, and he looked at per acre revenues. All right, so Connecticut, by and large, is a property tax state. That's where a lot of the tax money and municipal money comes from. So when you look at this, you really get a sense that when you start doing infill and multifamily, if you're a local government, that's where the money is. Okay, so it can be kind of scary. right? Because a lot of times, when we're talking about multifamily infill, that has a whole bunch of connotations. I'm not immune to that at all. But let me tell you about a story about my son's second grade teacher. He's 11 now, he's in 5th grade. And he had this amazing teacher, Miss Langford. She was from Texas. And she's one of these teachers that you want your son to have. Particularly as a second grader, right? How many parents do we have here that had kids go through, elementary school? How many parents do we have? Yeah, right. You remember your son's second grade teacher. You don't yet because they're just little. But she was great. She inspired learning. She came to Arlington, Virginia, which is where I'm from. She worked for a couple of years, and then she went back home to Texas. She couldn't afford to live there. So when I start talking in my neighborhood about multifamily housing, I talk about housing for Ms. Langford. So let's not let our fears get a hold of us about the unknown. Let's start putting names and faces. Do we want our children's second grade teachers to be living in our community where they can invest? Do we want our police chief? Do we want our librarian? These are the folks, when you talk to developers and they're doing the pro formas, when they're figuring out how they can make a development pencil, this is what they're looking at. They're looking at that demographic of what we call workforce housing, which is a very technical term for Ms. Langford. All right, so I want, when we start talking about infill, when we start talking about multifamily, when we start talking today about affordable housing, what we're talking about is allowing our children's school teachers to live alongside us. Now, it's another issue if we want to start talking about education and how little they get paid. It's a secondary issue. But for right now, and not only do these higher densities, right? I'm so sorry. Not only do they have higher revenues, but they also cost less to serve. And this makes a lot of sense. If you're going to put a multifamily housing structure right, again, in the Cedar Street station, the water and the sewer is already there. The transportation is already there. Now, again, flip it around and think about that greenfield area, the last development that went out on the edge. You had to put in the roads. You certainly had to put in some water. You might have had to put in some sanitation, some sewer. It becomes much more expensive, and that's what we're finding across the country, that what's bankrupting a lot of local governments, and this is really happening a lot in Virginia, is that as we begin to spread out, right, the infrastructure cost from the local government alone is what's really killing us. And it's just not about housing. I know I've been talking a little bit about housing, but I want to get back to the mixed use, because we've heard from a lot of people that you wanted to be able to walk to get to your different places. And when you look at an analysis of where do you get your highest revenues, it is without fail a mixed-use development, where you're able to combine the housing, the office, the civic on a per acre basis versus, and I love the statistic from Asheville, right? So 1 acre of a 3-story mixed-use development yields 5.5 times the tax revenue of a 1 acre typical suburban development. And again, as we start talking about how to generate the money to create the excitement, to create the vibrancy on the ground, these are the types of economic development strategies, using development to help build your tax revenue and reduce your infrastructure costs. So I've been talking a lot about economic development, but why are we doing this? Why are we even talking about this? So many of the commissioners really mentioned the issues about the changing demographics, and that is happening across the country. We know the baby boomers, we've been hearing about the baby boomers for a long time, but the millennials, the 20-somethings, is actually a larger generation. And survey after survey after survey has consistently said that anywhere between 30 to 50% of the population wants to live in a vibrant, mixed-use, walkable community. Yet, as our developer friends will tell us, the market is responding with only 5% of that. So when you look at this pent-up demand, if you've got 30 to 50% of the population wants to live in that type of place, well then you've got 5% of the market responding. There's a gap there that needs to be addressed. And so clearly then you've got the 50% that still want to live in your low-density single-family house, and that's okay. What we're trying to work on when we talk about these policies is that delta, what we call the low-hanging fruit, that the people who want to live there have the opportunity to live there. There's also a growing population, everyone is well aware of that. We're supposed to add another 50 million people, another 100 million people in the next 50 years to the U.S. And so I know I talk to a lot of state and local governments, and the issue that many are facing is where and how are these people going to grow. And then two, what we're finding is that many communities, regions, have a lot of underdeveloped space. When you look at Hartford, for example, right? There's something like 22% of your land mass in the city is dedicated to parking. That's an economic void. I mean, we're not talking, I don't want to throw Hartford under the bus, but you can begin, when you go back to your towns, begin thinking, where is the underutilized piece of land? Where's that parking lot that could be modified? Where are the corners? Where are those areas of activity that we can begin to start some type of excitement? And the other piece that I think is really important, particularly for a place like Connecticut, which has such a great town tradition, is let's start supporting our local businesses. If we want long-term sustainable prosperity, which nobody said, but I'm guessing, I see a lot of nods. It's like, yeah, who doesn't want that, right? We need to start investing in the citizens and the business people of Connecticut. I mean, these numbers are pretty, is this the right one? Yeah, these numbers I found pretty shocking, and I just learned them last week, that a power center, a Walmart power center, only returns 6% of their receipts back into the local community. A franchise like McDonald's, 20%, but a local business returns 60%. So I want to ask you all, when a visitor comes into town and visits you, call it your brother, your grandmother, your college roommate, where do you take them? Where do you show them? Come on, more hands. There we go. Where do you take them? Okay, you got to raise your hand so we can do this one at a time. So a visitor comes in and you want to show them your town. Where do you take them? Yes, ma'am.
Downtown Chester.
Downtown Chester.
Antique stores in Woodbury.
Antique stores in Woodbury. Yes, ma'am.
Downtown Solid.
Downtown Collinsville. Yes, ma'am.
The Reservoir.
The Reservoir. Yes, ma'am. The beach. You know, nobody mentioned that you take them to Walmart. Really? You don't take them to driving? That's the point here, that we want to identify and celebrate those places that are unique, those places that support our local culture, and that really comes down to supporting our local businesses. And what we're finding across the board is that there are a number of emerging trends that backs up all of this. And the one that I'm most excited about, that I think is going to be really key for kind of retrofitting our suburban environment, is this idea of hyperlocalism. It's supporting the local businesses. It's also urban agriculture. It's this idea that we should become more sustainable and more self-sufficient, not across the board, but it's this real kind of makers movement that I think for many Connecticut towns offers incredible opportunity to begin to bring increased vibrancy, increased activity into your, see, even the little one agrees, right? Into your town. So how do we begin to do this, right? How do we begin to take some of our places and how we've developed and transform it into a people-scale environment? Because we can't begin to do the hard work until we can begin imagining it, which is why I wanted you all to say of what you wanted. So keep that in mind, what you wanted for your town, from the small town, the walkable, not getting in the car, wanting to have your kids, your free-range kids. Keep that in mind, because we need to be able to imagine the possibilities. We need to be able to grasp what we want as we move through this. Because the very first thing we need to do is to envision it. We need to be able to say, this is what I want to do. Now, how many planners, professional planners do we have here? Yeah, I see a lot. And I'll say I'm the anti-planner. And I'll tell you why. So much effort goes into these long, politically intense, right? You guys all know what I'm talking about, updates in your comprehensive plan. When in actuality, I think that we can bring it back down to a much simpler level. Put a yellow sticky on an empty storefront, a bunch of yellow stickies, and say, what should I be next? How can we begin to start creating, right, or activate our main streets? Is there any way we can perhaps subsidize a lease or offer lower lease to an artist group coming in where they activate the movement just for 6 months? Is there any way we can begin thinking about what we want, how we might be able to transform this road? There's this group called Build a Better Block, and I love the idea of it. As people are grappling about changing the roads, we can't do that, I don't want that, no, yes, we need to do this, no, what am I gonna do? So they bring in hay bales, and potted trees from a nursery, and they're like, this is what it's gonna look like, what do you think? Let's try it out. And the community, like a festival, spends an afternoon figuring out how would this roundabout work through the hay bales? How would our Main Street work if we narrowed it and put in on-street parking? And they begin to experience it. And that's the type of visioning and planning that I really think we need to engage in. All right, so the next is regional context. And this is something I've thought about a lot, because so many places when they start on this process, they're like, all right, I'm ready for this, where am I going to go? And they go to what they think is the most obvious piece, and I want to go through this kind of step by step. So the first kind of cut is, do you have any transit? Because that investment can be really important. And then looking at within a half a mile of that investment, are there any underutilized sites? And if you don't have any transit, are there any sites that are near or adjacent to public infrastructure? Or any infrastructure upgrades planned in an area? So many towns here in Connecticut aren't going to be recipients of the transportation infrastructure expenditures that are occurring. But infrastructure investments are occurring in your towns. Where are you putting new stormwater management? Where are you doing road upgrades, road repaving? Start thinking strategically about where you're spending your money, right? And then what about our employment areas? And then are any of these properties hard or soft? Can be bought or sold, I'm sorry. So this is Sandy City, which is just south of Salt Lake City, Utah. They had made a significant investment in light rail, and they had a 2.5 square mile redevelopment plan. And here's kind of a close-up of one area that I wanted to look at. There's the Metro Rail. There are the two stops. Because I wanted to see if this is the kind of methodology that I applied, how would I apply it. Here are two schools. The upper yellow, orange circle is the old historic district, and then you have a university and a stadium. So there was a lot of activity in here. And then I looked at these two sites as possible areas to start kickstarting the redevelopment. And the upper is the self-storage kind of industrial plots that they're totally underutilized, and the bottom is a parking lot for an expo center that's never fully used. And so when we dug a little bit deeper, that these plots were totally available on the market to begin the redevelopment process. Yet interestingly, the officials of Sandy City decided instead to focus on the mall. So again, think strategically about where you might have areas of traction within your community. The second is you gotta make it easy, you gotta make it legal, right? We all know that the developers are not the bad guys when they build out the single family, low density development. They're not the bad guys, let's be perfectly clear. It's the local codes and ordinances that make it easier to develop there. So if we want to invest in our downtowns, let's make it the easiest place to invest. In Wallingford, you all want to bring the energy from your Main Street downhill, make it incredibly easy to invest there. So think strategically and think carefully about what do your codes and ordinances, what do the local land development regulations say, and how can you update and change those. And one quick example of Columbia Pike in Arlington, Virginia, the only thing that they did was to put in a form-based code. And the development has just taken off in that area because from the developer's perspective, it became easy. It was easy to invest there. It was easy to redevelop. Once the code changed, we really saw investment go straight up. You want to follow your infrastructure investments. This is so critical. I spent a large part of my professional life working on stormwater management. Yes, I know, terribly exciting. But what I found was a lot of municipalities were investing in their stormwater kind of hit or miss. And then they came to me to say, Lynn, I want some money in my downtown. Topeka, Kansas comes to mind on this. Anyone here from Topeka? They have a gorgeous downtown, a gorgeous downtown, just in small streets, you know, what you would think of a kind of typical New England, and they came to EPA about helping them with some stormwater management out of the edge. I was like, well, wait a minute, this is an infrastructure investment. You might not think of it that way, but let's direct it to downtown. Let's figure out how you can really begin to leverage and concentrate your investment to bring the vibrancy back. So think strategically about it, because in areas where you have cooler real estate markets, it's so important, because if the local government begins to invest in a particular neighborhood or street, you're sending an incredibly strong signal to the private sector to say, hey, we're investing here. We care about this place. And then they'll follow suit. That's why this $1.5 billion transportation investment that you're all making is so important. You're sending an incredibly strong signal to the developers to say, hey, come on, this is important to us. We want to develop here. And then, you know, what do I keep saying about putting people first, maximizing the pedestrian? It's so important to get the streets right. And one of the things that I saw when I took the tour of the 4 towns is that a lot of the streets could be improved. That as a walker, and I say this really, I understand where you came from on this, but I also want to say that investing in streetscape improvements can be incredible, right? And Lodi, California is a great example of this. They spent $4.5 million to retrofit just 5 downtown blocks. And I have part about a dozen of these streetscape improvement stories. But so Lodi, California, $4.5 million to retrofit 5 downtown blocks. They widened the sidewalks, they put the roads on a diet, they put in on-street parking, they put in a lot of green. You always have to have a lot of green, just wait and see about that. And no planning, and it attracted 60 new businesses and increased downtown revenue sales by 30%. Santa Clarita, also in California, did the same thing. They just did a streetscape improvement of the 3-block downtown. No plan whatsoever. I talked to the guys, like we just wanted to make it safer for people to walk to these places, to really celebrate the pedestrian. And when that became the performance standard, to make the pedestrian not only feel safe but celebrated, you saw the entire downtown change. So you need to get the streets right. We need to get the parking right. We talked about Hartford and how they increased the parking that they had in downtown from, I think in 1960, it was like 10% of the land mass, and then it doubled to almost 22%. And as parking increased in Hartford, the number of people living downtown decreased. But as we start talking about Newington in particular, right, as we are shifting from a place where we have car dependence to car independence, we're going to have to be mindful about parking, right? We can't just say, hey, we're going to get rid of our parking requirements, we're just going to make everybody walk. Well, the fact of the matter is, right here, right now, any sort of redevelopment that occurs, you're going to need a car. So what are we going to do? Let's put the parking in back of the store, number one. Number two, if we're going to build a garage, let's think about future uses. Let's build the garage that it could be easily adapted in 10 years or so to condos. This is New York City, but a better story, and I can't get a picture, of Albany, New York, that did this. Increasingly, developers are spending a little bit of money up front on their parking garages so it can be easily transformed as the neighborhood changes. So that's, particularly in Newington, that's something to keep in the back of your mind. Add more green. Kay Benfield, a friend of mine who works at NRDC, just came out with this book, People Habitat. And increasingly, there are a number of stories and studies that come out that the more time we spend with our green spaces, the better. And I like to think of it this way. Think about your buildings in your town. Now think about all the space between the buildings. That includes the roads, includes the parking lot, includes the sidewalk. Think about the space between the buildings as vibrant public space. And once you begin to think about the space between the buildings as vibrant public space, how do you really make it pop? You're going to add green. You're going to add street level stormwater management. Again, you're achieving 2 objectives. You're adding green, you're creating a safer pedestrian environment. Oh yeah, and you're meeting your stormwater requirements. So that's actually a 3-fer. But as you begin to celebrate the pedestrian, as you begin to put streets first, as you begin to maximize the transportation investment, think about the space between the buildings and how you can incorporate more green. This is a great example from Emeryville, California. I'm not going to read it, you all can read it. And the piece about that is that it adds texture. Think about your favorite places in your town right now. Now, raise your hands if they're your favorite places in your town, in your neighborhood has green in it. Like any kind of green. Come on, higher people, higher. Yeah, yeah. So that's about 80%, right? And so think about how you feel when you're in your favorite place and how that might change. And then the next piece, we talked about parking charges with future uses, but I want to go a little bit more broad than this, and talk about actually changing the development scale. So this is a site, which was a brownfield site in Alexandria, Virginia. It's just south of Washington. Sorry, I don't have a here. It's about 40 acres. It was a brownfield site. It was cleaned up in 1997. In 1997, the real estate market in Washington was kind of in the toilet. Just so you know, I moved there in 97. And so the only thing the market could support in 1997 was strip mall retail. You see the Target right here? But what the city officials did is they put everybody in there in a 15-year lease. They managed public expectations to say, you know what, this is strip retail right now because that's all that the market is there for, but we are going to plan for future development. And so what's happening, starting in 2017, the strip mall is being torn down. The money was achieved to add in a new station. The rail line already went through. And we're going to put in about 40,000 new residential units and 7.5 million square feet of office retail and open space. But it's hard. Yeah. Yeah, yeah. So Andy from Newington just said 40,000. What's that? I know that's large. Think of the scale. But the one example I want to, it just came to me. So it's a little bit of a tangent, but it's a good tangent. So also in Arlington, just north of Alexandria, the Roslyn-Ballston corridor, one of the best examples of transit-oriented development in the United States. They added 50,000 units over 10 years. Does anyone want to guess what happened to traffic in Arlington along that corridor? 50,000 units over a 10-year period of time. I can't even tell you the millions of square feet of retail. Come on, somebody tell me, who thinks traffic counts went way up? That traffic was a nightmare.
I have a cousin who lives in Boston.
No, it went down. That's right, traffic counts. We're not talking models and data so much when you hear people talk about whatever, it's modeled, it's using these complicated econometrics. But this is actual counts that people standing there like, oh, that's a car. I mean, think about that. In Arlington, Virginia, you've got 33% of the population that doesn't own a car. They have car share, they have bikes. It is that exact community. Now, it's a big community. It's much, much different than what you all can achieve here. But so when you're adding 40,000, my point is that even though Alexandria, they have the means in place, that nobody's expecting traffic to go way up. So let's bring it all down to you all. And I'm about to open this up for questions. You guys have 169 fiefdoms, right? That makes planning and coordination so easy. Am I right? Yeah. So as a start, one thing that you guys can do is start talking to each other. Right? That we're in this together. And a strong town begets a strong region, begets a strong state. Because not everybody is going to want to live in a very dense, mixed-use place. Some people are going to want to live in their small 1,800-person town. And the only way that we can help her achieve, I want to stay living here in this small town, is that in places like Newington and like Wallingford, that we're able to concentrate development in appropriate areas. Strong regions, strong towns. Let's start coordinating more. Also, the other thing that you all can do for all of your investments is to start thinking about putting people first, not cars. Because mobility, we've gotten this all wrong. Mobility is not about moving cars efficiently from point A to point B. It's about moving us. We want to think about how we can move efficiently from point A to point B. So think comprehensively. about mobility. And the other thing is you guys are going back, so we have so many municipal officials here, is to start thinking about how you can maximize this transportation investment. And we'll talk more when we get into the four towns. But study after study after study after study after study, I'm going to fall asleep, has said, you want to maximize your transit investment, you want to increase ridership, you need to put affordable housing right next to it. You need to make places for Miss Langford and the fire chief to live. Because that's hands down what's going to happen. You put in high-end condos, people aren't going to get out of their car. That's what we see across the board. This idea of affordability, right, which is an emerging trend and increasing less coming up. I'm not talking about affordable housing. I'm talking about affordability, that our lifestyles need to be affordable, that we need to be able to live the life that we want to live and not always feel under it. And so we need to start thinking comprehensively about how much we pay for transportation in addition to how much we pay for housing and how much we pay for food. We need to put all of that together. So it's called this H+T, but as gas prices, they're only going to go one way. I mean, let's think forward in 50 years, right? If it's somewhat expensive to drive now, it's going to be really expensive to drive there. And I'm not saying that everybody gives up their car. I have a car, I like my car, I like to drive my car, and I love the fact that I have multiple choices on how I get to work. I can bike, I can walk to the metro, I'm going to take the metro, and just recently, this past fall, I joined a carpool. I needed to shave a few minutes, I needed to shave 10 minutes off of my commute. And oddly, the carpool works. So it's about enabling places where we have choices on where and how we want to live. So all of this is really hard to do. This is not easy. And so one thing to keep in mind is that there's a lot of help out there. Right? The Partnership for Strong Communities is a statewide organization. It has programs and it has assistance and it can help you navigate that. And if you don't like them, David, for any reason, I don't understand that. I think he's an awesome guy, right? There are a dozen other national and local organizations that are offering free technical assistance. A lot of this comes from the HUD, EPA, DOT, Partnership for Sustainable Communities. That will be my only plug for the day, moving forward. But if you have a problem, there's help out there and to seek it. Connecticut recently is putting together this catalytic fund. It's not all together now. It'll be about $50 million with the hope that it will leverage an additional $150 million of pre-development. So think about how that may play into some of your plans. And then finally, Congress just approved another $600 million in TIGER grant. And I won't tell you what the acronym for TIGER stands for, but it's essentially alternative transportation. You all have so many different cool things going on, not only in the four towns that I visited, but across the board. Think about how you might be able to tap in to some of the TIGER funds for implementing. This is implementation money for cool funds. So with that, I want to see if we have any questions on anything. Then we're going to take a little bit of a break, and then I'm going to dive into my series of suggestions for the four towns. So any questions on what we chit-chatted about right now? Yes, sir. Green.
Do we know if Connecticut's ever done a study on turnover rates for professionals like teachers, as you mentioned, in our towns that have high housing costs? Has there ever been a study done to see if that's an issue that we can sort of use?
I'm punching that today.
Well, what I can tell you is that the Connecticut State Teachers Retirement System does look at the ages, and while, you have to understand that it's all demographics. What I can tell you is that 37% of the teachers in Connecticut are over 50 years old now. And my guess is that many of them have many years in. So what we're going to see, even if we saw just a meandering stream of teacher retirements, you're going to see a lot of retirements in the next 10 to 15 years. And you're going to have to hire new teachers at whatever the beginning salary is. And as Lynn said, they're going to need a place that they can afford to live in. I would say one thing about questions. We'll take some more. We're not going to take a long break. We're not going to take any break, actually. If you need to go to the bathroom, do it while we're doing questions now. So, other questions?
I'll lead into the question. I think I would not be surprised if most of the people in this audience are already strong advocates of what you're advocating. I come from a small town in northwest Connecticut that has a traditional downtown, that has a downtown shopping center, has affordable living. We had a technical assistance grant from Smart Growth America last year.
Which is funded out of my office. Sorry.
So I thought I'd put in that plug. We were the only town in the state of Connecticut that had one last year. It advocates everything that you're advocating. But I think the disconnect, and this is the question, is between the local officials that are here and the high-level state officials such as the commissioners, based upon the smart growth studies that we've had and studies that go back decades that promote the kind of things that you're advocating, the state doesn't fund those things. We've submitted application after application. So it's kind of the state's talking the talk, but they're not walking the walk and giving the local community. When you look at these Tiger funds, it would be interesting to see how many go toward traditional transportation instead of the unique, innovative ways that we're trying. Because again, we've submitted dozens of applications to narrow our street, to do those things, and the state doesn't fund it. They talk, so it's those low-level to mid-level state employees, I think, that are the ones that need to be at this type of conference to understand what we at the local level are trying to do.
Got it. So, that's a really good point, and I want to address it two ways. So, the majority of transportation funding goes from the feds to the states then distribute it to their cities via formula. And within state rules and regulations, there's criteria on how that will be funded. Same with water infrastructure, same with USDA rural development grants. You know, I can list all the funding on that. And the gentleman is absolutely right. Smart Growth America has recently done a report that suggests anywhere between about $450 billion a year of federal funds gets filtered down to essentially support this low-density development pattern. That's why the Tiger grants are so critical and important. They don't go to the states. They don't go to the states. They actually go to folks like me. I'm part of the review committee, or I was a couple of years ago. I don't think I'll do it this year. But it goes directly to Washington. It's a discretionary grant program. It doesn't go to the state, which is why it's so important. When we do look at the recipients of that, what you'll find is that it really truly is this kind of innovative transportation options, which is why it's so important that they got funded again. So definitely look at that. But addressing the broader issue of how do we fix that issue, that's a hard one, and one that a nut that we've been trying to crack is to work more directly with states to identify, that rule on page 3, paragraph 2 in their manual that essentially limits their ability to be more creative in the funding. I have met very few state, very few state programs that are actively trying to support this low density. But what you're finding is that the rules and the criteria that they developed 15, 20, 30 years ago on guidance from the feds essentially limits and ties their hands. So the trick is finding out those criteria and trying to change it. And if you ask me, I think you're at the cusp. You've got Mr. Rifkin moving into the governor's office. Apparently you guys have an active governor. I think that this is a time where you might be able to see some of those state changes. So, sorry, I'll try to be briefer with the Q&A.
I have a question about the threefer that you just described earlier, the street trees, the placemaking. In your experience working with our state agencies, do you get the sense that they understand that there's some technical aspects to that that require good design and landscape architecture? Because Connecticut doesn't have a job description for landscape architecture. And I see that as a problem.
Yeah, so I'm not fully versed. I haven't done a lot of work in Connecticut, mostly because Connecticut has NEMO, non-home source education for municipal officials, and they've been really active in that area. But they're moving. I just trying to walk this line. It's a jump. So much of this is hard. And if you are responsible, if you're the public official, where's the mayor? The mayor's right here. So the buck stops with him. So you're there. So the buck stops with him. So he's going to have to make a decision ultimately, even if he has folks under him, of, yeah, I want to put in a green street. He's going to look at all the data, and that's a hard spot for him to be in. I mean, because this stuff is hard. So how can we make it easier for the mayor to make that decision? We need to support it. And a lot of that doesn't happen. And a lot of the conversation doesn't happen. And then particularly on green infrastructure, a lot of the data isn't there yet. But you have places that are beginning to turn. You've got Philadelphia, you've got Chicago, you've got Milwaukee, St. Louis, Covington, Kentucky, which is where I've done a lot of work. Cincinnati, I mean, these places are starting. So if Connecticut hasn't been great to date, my guess is the next 5 to 10 years it will be.
Linda, we need over $1 billion for the New Haven, Hartford, Springfield commuter rail line. Obviously, there's only $600 million in tire grant for the entire country. How are we going to get from here to there? We need billions of dollars to complete some of these infrastructure improvements.
Yeah. You're not alone in that. So the idea is to break it down, right? There is an infrastructure deficit on our transportation and on our water infrastructure that is in the hundreds of billions, if not trillions of dollars. So the first thing that we need to do is to support the infrastructure investments that we've already made. So not create additional stress on the system by expanding the footprint. And then the second thing is to break down what is the incremental piece that I can do now, and to get funding from that, and then to leverage that success, and then to do the next piece of it. It can't be done. It can't be done overnight.
Okay. Let me just respond to a couple of questions. I'm not sure I'll remember all of them. But point was made, I think, over here about the fact that it's been difficult in some cases to get DOT to approve certain concepts or approve funding for certain types of improvements within community centers. There is a major shift in policy going on at DOT, but DOT is also a very large organization. Cultural change has to occur. Cultural change is underway at Connecticut DOT. We're changing a lot of the way we do business. I think if you look at even basic things like our pedestrian and sidewalk policies, we've undergone major changes. We are on the verge of adopting a complete streets policy officially after several years of actually implementing some of the individual practices. So we are changing, I think, is you talked about the demographic change, as a lot of our older engineers shift out of our workforce and we've been replacing it. A lot of those come in with a fresh set of ideas. They've been trained a different way. So we as an institution are changing our policies, but even the people that implement those policies are changing as well.
We have time for one more question because then we're going to move on to the next section of this.
I just had a suggestion for that question that was raised about how to fund this. In Europe, and I know they're considering this in Boston too, it's kind of like TIF financing, where
TIF is tax incremental funding.
where the increased value of the land that accrues to areas where transit is put in is captured, and developers actually provide the funding for the transit. They can see that they're going to benefit from that transit. We really have to start doing that in Connecticut. We desperately need that money. And we have some very creative developers in Connecticut who I think would pony it up. We have a developer in New London who built a condominium in a very bad neighborhood. And what he did what he's doing now, at first he held block parties to move all the people in the neighborhood. Now he's buying up all these really inexpensive, dilapidated houses, and he's condominiumizing. This is an area right next to downtown. If that's not going to help downtown, nothing will. And he's making condominiums out of these houses. It's called City Flats. It's a very innovative and exciting project, and I think we need to try some of these new ideas.
Yeah, I want to just follow up with that. That's a very good suggestion. In Tyson's Corner, Virginia, the local merchants tax themselves a half% to help pay the local share for the silver line that is being put in. Those types of TIF financing work best in areas which have demonstrated COD success. It can be hard to kind of kickstart it, so the first thing you have to do is almost find creative financing upfront, demonstrate that it can be successful, and then you can get the merchants and the developers to kind of kickstart it out. So with that, and I'll be sticking around certainly after the talk to answer more questions. But we're now going to move quickly to the 4 Connecticut towns that I visited: Newington Junction, Wallingford, Windsor Locks, and Clinton. But before we do that, again, this is supposed to be interactive. I want to ask you all a question. I want you to envision the most horrible place that you've ever been. That if you were a child and you stayed out past curfew and you were out drinking and doing all of this jazz, that you would be sent there as punishment. And I want you just real quickly, like we've been doing it, what would you do? How would you design that town? How would you design the most awful place that you can think of? So let's start with that. You're an evil mastermind. Another way to think about this is in your own community. What aspects about your own community that you hate?
Where do I begin? I would bring in people who smoke on the street and drop their cigarette butts everywhere, people who walk the dog and don't pick up bathrooms, graffiti artists who come out at night and screw up everything. Let's see, people who park badly and buildings of things with PLs, crack sidewalks, you know.
Okay. All right, good.
Broken roads.
That's a good start.
Trash
How
on the
would we design the macro piece of it? What other things would we add in? Because you raised a whole bunch of excellent social capital. So I'd push back with you a little bit on the food. No. You're not going to get anywhere with me on that.
Probably would add in a lot of locally unwanted land uses, LULUs. So, you know, hazardous waste incinerators, you know, anything.
Belly.
Yeah.
Gross.
All of that stuff.
All that stuff. Okay, a few more. This is good. Absolutely gray.
No color. No color, everything's absolutely gray.
Gray. Bad design.
Multi-lane roadways or highways that go right through the community with cars going very fast.
I know, right? We're talking about celebrating pedestrians. No way. Yeah. Any others? This is great.
No people around.
Yeah. Yeah, this
No
goes to
feet
the
on the
social
street.
capital bit.
No feet on the street. There's a problem.
And no street lighting, very bad design, and of course, no trees is even worse.
So now the benevolent dictator, the awful evil dictator has been thrown out. There was a coup, right? And David is now in charge. Just for kicks and giggles. David's now in charge of things. So what would you tell David of how he would fix that? Right, so
There
let's
was
get a detailed.
transportation in the northwest corner.
So let's get as detailed as
Decent
possible.
transportation.
You know, there's so many planners in here, there's so many local governments, there's so many incredibly informed citizens. What would you tell David as specifically as possible what he should fix? What would you want to see change?
Zoning regulations.
Zoning regulations, okay. Anything else? What do we need to tell David? Because we want this little one here who's so interested, right? I used to bring my son all the time.
That's what time.
We want him, is it India Blue, to grow up and be a vibrant contributor to our neighborhood. So let's have him in mind as we think. Yeah, we're here.
Say, David, could you please wave your magic wand and make state authorities and funding sources get in line with local priorities?
There we go. Okay, better coordination. Come on, guys. You came up with so many bad things. So think about it another way. What is it about your neighborhood? Your neighborhood, the design of it, or the social capital. What is it about your neighborhood that you love, that excites you? That you're just so excited to go home every day, not to your own home, but to go home to your community. Here's the thing you love about it. Yes, sir.
I work with families transferring into the area quite often and have for quite a number of years. And there's something unique about this part of Connecticut and Western Massachusetts. An executive comes in or a working family comes in, find a nice home, they get into the community, then a transfer comes up 2 to 3 years from now, they don't take it. They said the quality of life that we have here, we're so used to it, we take it for granted. We're physically beautiful, we're accessible to everywhere, and it's getting that buy-in from the local folks that really will make them appreciate it more. There isn't much not to love about this area.
Okay, couple more. We need to give David direction. We need to tell him how to achieve that. Yes, sir.
We haven't talked about safety or the feeling of safety in our communities. And that's one of the, I'm a building developer. And I don't build in places where my buyer would not buy because they don't perceive that they're safe. So we're looking for that from an entrepreneur's point of view.
Okay, all right. One more. Yes, ma'am.
How do you change the community groups that are hanging on to the past so aggressively, and there's elected officials and commissions that want to hold on desperately?
So to fix that. Okay, so now, there's another one, and so we'll go over here. So now you're 90 years old. You're sitting in your rocking chair, right? And you're looking out over your life. What would you tell the generation of planners that are coming up? What do you wish that your town had done differently? Right? You're looking out over your whole life. Yes, sir.
Excuse me. I grew up on a shore town, which at that time had a lot of lower working class people, and wealthy people who lived right on the shore. And it was an intermediary of people that created a very vibrant, interesting community. The town now is an economic divide. Most people want to live there, more want to live there. You go north of one street, and it's how do you address that?
Yeah. Well, I'm not answering questions right now, but I can. Okay, I'm trying to get folks. Okay, yes, ma'am.
Okay, I'm 90 years old now. I had to give up my car keys. So I guess, and from that gentleman's statement behind me, living in Northwest Connecticut, I would hope that if it hadn't occurred by the time I'm 90, that this generation would move forward with better transit in Northwest Connecticut, in the rural areas.
Yeah, and I think that's exactly right. I mean, this was a hard exercise. It usually takes place over a course of an hour. So you guys were great to kind of do it within a few minutes. But to think about how you would design a bad place, how would you fix it, and then what advice you would give to the next generation coming up. So let's keep that in mind as we go through these 4 towns. And first I want to talk a little bit about the Connecticut context. We talked about it earlier, this $1.5 billion in transit. But you guys in Connecticut, you have an amazing tradition of these New England towns. You have a lot of vacant or underutilized land, right? And you have a shortage of multifamily housing. All the reports are coming back that there is shortage. And what that all means is that you have amazing potential. When I went through the 4 towns, that's all I saw was this potential. Like, it was so close, I could almost taste it, what Newington would be, or Wallingford, down the hill. I could see where that potential was going. And so I know that this can be hard, this can be challenging. You've got community groups, but you need to hold on to the fact that there is incredible potential here. So as I said, I looked at these 4 different towns, and while I'm going to provide some ideas for them to consider within this context of how can we begin to revitalize and to leverage that transportation investment that's occurring in each of those 4 towns, I also want folks to know that something that I may suggest for Newington may be perfectly applicable for Wallingford as well. I didn't want to be duplicative or reiterative. All right. So in Newington, there are a lot of assets there. You've got this 9.5 mile dedicated bus rapid transit. And the more I learned about BRT, the more it became clear that many communities not all that different from the Hartford area, Cleveland, for example, has been able to leverage $114 for every dollar invested. I mean, who sees these kind of returns anymore? And this type of return is occurring in just about every single BRT system, as long as it's done in the way that you've done it. Certainly, you know, there are systems that are called BRT, but they can still get stuck in traffic and the rest of it. Newington too has higher education. The Central Connecticut University, a lot of communities would just love to have an institution of higher learning. You have an incredibly strong downtown already, so you have that culture already of what people, you can go and you kick the tires. You also have an aging population as well as a student population. You're at this both bit, so you have a ready-made market for some infill. So here's an aerial of the Cedar Street station. And the first thing that I saw is that you have existing retail right here, and you need to create a connection. When I looked up, I was standing at the bus stop, and I looked up to the back of the strip mall, and it was just this ugly black wall, or white wall, this is white. What would happen to the businesses if they created this awesome back entrance, and you created a walkway to go up? So same business, we're not changing the land use, this is the type of incremental steps of just saying, hey, instead of having a front entrance, also have a back entrance, right? The other thing that is going to be really critical for having this area pop is to activate the street. When you bring in the buildings, and we'll get into that, it's absolutely critical that you have 4 to 6 foot sidewalk widths. At least, I would say 6 foot, maybe as much as 10 feet. Right now, I know, oh, make my heart go, right? You want to activate the street, you want to make sure that the buildings come up, you want to make sure that the pedestrian is safe, you know, make sure that you have the buffer. So I think you might not, you probably don't want to put on street parking there, so instead, make sure that you put in a bike lane, that's going to be a buffer, put in street trees on that street, put in the bench furniture, so there's this space between where people are walking and where the cars are going, right? This whole area, I think of it as a block, right? Imagine stick construction, 4 to 5 stories. Imagine that the first floor could be an innovation lab, an entrepreneur district. It could be a co-working place. It could be a space where you're bringing in these entrepreneurs. And then above, you're going to have, you know, studio, 1 bedroom, maybe a few 2 bedroom apartments. And it'll be a mix. It'll be geared for the aging population that's moving in there, that wants to have more choices on where and how they want to live. You want to be able to market it to the students, but it's creating this vibrancy. And you know what's going to happen, that if you get this development right, pretty soon that strip mall and all of that, it's the retail on that area, that the land value will shoot up, that it no longer makes sense to have strip retail, and that will turn over. It's not going to happen right away. It'll probably happen in the next 10 or 15 years. But if you put in surface parking lot right there, it's all over. You've lost the investment of the BRT. And I don't mean to be so strong on that, but you under no circumstances want to put in surface parking. And if you do need to put in parking, hold on. Shared parking. If you do need to put in parking, think about how much parking you need, because you've got this huge surface parking lot. Do you really need that much? And if you have to put in a parking garage, think about how it can be adaptively reused. So, okay, I'm doing this. Bike share, bike parking lane. Think about, you really want to enable folks to get there, particularly from the university, on bikes. Will bike share work? It doesn't have to be a fancy bike share. There are a bunch of examples of local bike shares where it is just a handful of bikes. And maybe that would work here, maybe a more formal bike share would work. Yes, sir?
Then just the Capital Region Council of Governments has a proposal to actually initiate a regional bike share program, and that may be going forward. We're doing the evaluation now.
Excellent, excellent. And you want to connect to the university. Putting in this station right here and not connecting to the university is leaving money on the table. Let's just be clear. Like somewhere, somehow, you all need to think about putting in a Tiger grant to do streetscape improvements to make it easy for the university students to walk and bike there. Because right now, the biggest problem you have with this site are these arterials. So you need to figure out how you can to really leverage that.
The university owns a big chunk of land. The university is rich, or doing it, but the university owns 100 acres on the south side of the.
So more connections.
Please repeat the question.
Oh, what the mayor said? Yeah, what the mayor said is that the university owns 100 acres right in that upper quadrant, right? And they're looking to expand there. So as we're talking about connecting to the university, we want to make sure that we can also cross that bridge and have connections there to make sure that when the university expands in that area, that you can have the connection there. Yes, sir. Andy.
I hate to speak without a microphone, but I'll have the microphone anyway.
Okay. First, in fact, the DOT has already provided for that connection. The sidewalk is going up, and you can see it moves.
How wide is the sidewalk?
5 feet.
And does it abut directly to the street?
It crosses on the right-hand side of the screen. It crosses the street.
Does it abut?
It
Like,
does,
would you feel comfortable
no.
when you say DOT
Yeah.
has approved this? Let's get down to the.
No, they built it.
Would your 6-year-old feel comfortable?
Yes.
All right.
Yeah, no, it's fine, it's fine. And, but the part that hasn't been built is CCSU has been promising to do it for 2 years. So there's about a 500-foot gap, but we're sure that, and do that. Okay. 2 things that you're assuming, and here's where the federal government and the state government are screwing us. Number 1, providing challenges. Transit-oriented development means no cars. So even though there's a 22-foot difference in grade between the street and where the station is, and that's why you don't have an easy connection to the shopping plaza, because you got all 45 steps to get there. We say to the state, you want to get people to ride the busway, we want to provide parking that's not on the surface for development that's going to occur in the rectangle. How about helping out and leasing parking spaces so we can subsidize and entice the developer to put a 2-level parking garage that would hold 1,200 cars, 600 for the busway, 600 for the development that would go forward, like
Housing.
possibly where all the parking would be below ground. And DOT says, Tom, where's Tom? Okay, and DOT says?
Yes.
Oh, boy, you're getting more than you are.
Made a mistake giving up this microphone.
I don't want to turn this into a debate about CT Fast Track. That particular station, I forget how many spaces we have, 40 spaces in that. I think the department would be open to the idea if demand ever reaches the point that we exceed that capacity of the existing system. That's something we might think about. Right now, the CT Fast Track is set up largely to be a walk-in and bus-in type of facility, so there are parking available at most of the stations, but not maybe as much as what you might normally expect. It's all based on the forecasting.
We need the
Guts. We need the guts to believe that if this BRT is really going to be successful, you got to put the parking in there so you get people off the highway. Because we're only going to have one shot. We already have developers ready to go. They're not going to wait. If you don't want to build the garage, you got to fill it in. They're going to fill it in and move forward. The other thing is, yes, we want a bus. I mean,
Hold on.
wait, let me get it in. We want to walk and we want to bike, and DOT created no bike lanes, no sidewalks, even though we asked, and the reason was the silos that said the people who build mass transit, they don't control the roads and walkability and bikeability. So we need that as well. Thank you.
Oh, this is Dave. I do want to respond respectfully to the commissioner that it's not a chicken or egg, and this has been the problem with so many transportation investments, that if you put housing in this area, you will see the demand. This is not, well, you know, if we see it, it will come, because this is vacant land right now, and so the first piece of development that goes in there will lay the success or the failure of this station and this investment. This stuff is hard. You've got to take the leap to say, you know what we need in here? We need housing. And Andy, I would respectfully say that if you're gonna put in a garage, put in a 4-story garage, spend a little bit extra money so that in 10 years, that garage can be converted to offices. Do not put in a single-use garage that cannot be adapted again. Because again, that's shooting yourself in the foot. Plan for success. And that's the problem with so many of the conversations. You need to plan for success, that this will be an incredible station. Yes, sir. Mr. Brickley.
So, we call Howard. I just want to say, Andy Brecker was in the state government, he was deputy commissioner of economic development in the neighborhood. Was in state government and back in state government for a long time. The challenge we have right now is not to say how many I's do we need to dot, how many T's do we need to cross. It's about having vision and courage to say we're gonna do this, and we're gonna put the components in place because folks, we get to do this right once. Otherwise, we will be paying for many years in taxpayers' money by not leveraging the kind of development that Lynn is saying. So it's backing up and saying this has to happen in a way that makes sense to encourage the kind of growth that needs to be had. And I'd also add the opportunity here in Newington is also connecting seniors who may live in some of this housing with the university, who may be interested in the cultural aspects of what Central Connecticut State University has to offer. So it's sort of like, this is no excuse.
Just a quick word about timing. We're going to go, it's over. I want you to know that we're all having such a good time. I have every hope the food fight is going to break out any second. But just so you understand, we're going to go 10 minutes over. I'm going to turn it back to Lynn, and we're going to keep the questions short and crisp. And let's go.
In other words, he's telling me to speak more concisely. So moving on, because Cedar Street was such a good. Let's look at the Newington station. When we went here, David was quite worried I was going to get hit by a car because I kept going up the street to take pictures, which leads me to activating the community. These are two, I think there's new parking going in. Right, is that new parking that's going in? Yeah, so again, I understand that there's real life concerns, but that is not planning for success. That's not leveraging the investment. You want to activate the corners. You want to create a place where people love to go. And having a surface parking lot right there on this corner sends a signal to the cars to say, let's drive fast, let's drive here. You put in a development there. You put in 3 to 4 story mixed-use development. Definitely you need the affordable housing. You need the housing. You put in your first story retail. That's going to push the redevelopment of that far corner there. You create a place. We talked about when people come to visit, you take them to the parking lot. You take them to a place, and right now we're not setting ourselves up for success there, right? This, from what I understand, is soft. The developer is thinking about, the owner is thinking about selling it. Think about high-density, multi-family housing. Again, plan for success. The number one way to leverage this is to put more housing. Study after study has shown that if you want to maximize ridership, you need to put in affordable housing right next to it, right? And it really gets to that affordability. And I know affordable housing can be a scary thing, which is why it's not about a whole wide range of scary things that we're talking about. It's about providing housing for our school teachers. It's about providing housing for municipal workers. It's about providing housing for a lot of your children as they come out of school. The bike path here. I know, I was told there wasn't the right of way. The bike path ends 100 feet from the station. I'm a cyclist, and I was like, well, all right, what are you going to do with the first fatality? Because I can tell you right now that bikers, we're kind of a cranky bunch, and we absolutely will get in the bus right away and we'll go to the station. So just plan for it. Figure out how to do it. Are you going to run into the side through the neighborhood, or what about like blowing a hole because it's I'm not a transportation engineer. You know, it's a bridge that goes over, so there's a bunch of land. Put in a tunnel or something, but connect it. This is a transportation network is a network. It's about connections. And so you wouldn't have the people on the bus getting off, 100 feet from where they want to go. Why are you going to have the bikes do that as well? All right? And then adding the pedestrian buffers. I was looking at the sidewalk, and I knew it was a brand new sidewalk, and I'm sorry, guys, it was an awful sidewalk. We're talking about identifying and celebrating the pedestrian. We're talking about creating a place where we want to go. We're talking about how we can walk and feel safe, and there was no way, I don't have a picture, but there was no way that I would feel safe on it. It was a 5-foot sidewalk, it was beautiful, and it was right next to cars that were driving 40 or 50 miles an hour. Streetscape improvements, just saying. But that goes to exactly what Howard was saying, that we have an opportunity to get this right. So as we start talking about how to maximize this investment, let's get it right. So the other piece that I want to talk about, and I'll let you all read this slide, but there are incredible opportunities for BRT, and the number one indicator for this is government involvement. There was a study of about 21 transit-oriented development communities across the United States. This is done from the Institute of Development and Transportation. And what they found was that the single most important indicator of success of a TOD was not the transit. It was government involvement. It was government going in and aligning the codes and ordinance. It was government making investment in this area the easiest place to invest. It was government as a partnership. So I think that that's a take-home for all 4 of our towns. That if you want investment to come into to come into your towns, make it easy to come into your towns, into those areas. All right. And then the final point to put through, and I know that we're beating this dead horse, but if you want to increase ridership, if you want to maximize ridership, put it in affordable housing. So moving quite along, David's telling me that I'm talking too long. Windsor Locks, a lot of assets here. They just put in a affordable set aside, so there's a lot of market demand. There's amazing industrial buildings right by the water. Oh, that's right, water. It has prime waterfront opportunity. It's 9 minutes from downtown Hartford. There's a new commuter rail that's going in 17 trips a day. So you can all read that. You all know your town's best. So here's what I would suggest. Windsor Locks, where's Jen? Okay. So looking at me a little scared. Okay, so, and this is already in the works, but redeveloping the factory. And I thought, it was the last town that I was in that day, and I have to say, I just really enjoyed it. You had some amazing assets, right? The nursery with its wetlands, the coastal assets, the rivers. And so when I started thinking about what you all could do here, I thought, what we want to do is really redevelop the Unilever development too. And you know this already, I'm not telling you, but it's just not that property, that 30-acre property. There were a number of holes, think of Gap Tooth, or just surrounding the station that could really be filled in. There's a lot of existing development there that you wouldn't necessarily want to get rid of because it had the vibe of the place. There was these older houses, businesses in it. So the question would be to bring in the designer and how could you interweave, fill in the gap holes, yet maintain some of those older buildings that had successful businesses in that area. And the nursery as well. In that area, I know that you would probably want to redevelop it, but I would argue that you might want to think about how to use it to leverage some natural resources and to really maybe create a community garden. There's some natural areas. Natural areas so close to downtown are really hard to find. So be mindful, and maybe it's a community garden for 20 years while the market catches up. But maybe you don't want to do that. Maybe you want to maintain the small town feel that you have. So those are trade-offs. And then the other piece that I was looking at Route 1, it's not a really safe place to bike. But when you begin to think about using the nursery and thinking about, okay, I'm coming in from New York City, I'm coming in from New Haven, I want to have a great day at the beach at your state park. how can I bike there? A, where are the bikes that I can rent? Small business, right at the train station, seasonal. How can I then get down? Where's the bike routes? So you can begin to thinking of it as a holistic system. You have natural resources. How can you leverage the natural resources to not only support local businesses, seasonal businesses, but also to help with kind of redevelopment? So, so this is just one shot, and then it could really be transformed into something that's really quite unique. We've talked a lot about walking and the economic benefits of walking, but there are considerable economic benefits associated with biking as well. And here's the Unilever property that we talked about, and when you look at Redwood City in California, they put in 4-story housing to leverage their commuter rail. We don't have a lot of examples across the United States of how commuter rail has been leveraged. Redwood City is one example of it. And going back to this point that I keep hammering home, they put in affordable housing. You want to put in you want a successful transportation, you put in housing. So I kind of want to move now to talking about, and this is my last slide, and so now we're opening it up for discussion for the next few minutes, so ask any questions. But I kind of wanted to put the 4 towns on, I kind of wanted to hear from the 4 towns about what you all could do over the next 3 to 4 months by the end of the summer to begin to kickstart some revitalization. And you know, I put some down here, you know, establishing goals, really figuring out how you might want to do that and embed that within your own infrastructure investments. And then for, you know, for Newington, I think that you need to come up with a strategy of how to attract developers, maybe hosting a national competition. There is so much potential of what you have right there that you don't want to just rely on the local developers here. No offense to any of them. Bring in the best and the brightest. Again, if local government is the #1 indicator of something that's successful, it's like, all right, it's not necessarily an RFP. We want to hear what your designs are. You could be really creative about that. In Windsor Locks, I think a Tiger application, not just the streetscape improvements, would go a real long way. Same with Wallingford, looking again at your streetscape improvements, and then thinking about different landscape strategies to enhance that railway park. I thought that was really interesting. And then Clinton, as David said, I was at the Graduate School of Design last year, and I took on a couple of classes, and we're always looking for properties where we can do a design charrette. So cheap, free, right? Get a bunch of architectural students to say, hey, and so I can guarantee you some of the ideas will be awful, and some of them will be absolutely brilliant. But why not start batting that around? You know, so contacting the local architecture schools to say, hey, we have a site that we want to raise up for a possible design charrette. So that's it, actually. That's what I wanted to kind of say today. Sorry it has gone so long, but let's open it up for questions as well as from reactions from our 4 towns.
As we move forward with Connecticut Fast Track, and we've had the 4 towns meeting together with the OT and numerous other players in the system, one of the things that's come out very recently is a development issue, which is a lot of the banks and the people in the area, they don't have valuations that are showing what the value of this land really is. So as developers are going to try to get financing to do this, and the valuations come back from the banks, it's a major issue there. How do we address that so that people will start to realize it is a positive investment?
Getting financing is really difficult, and what we have found in other places, I know a good developer friend of mine in Roanoke, and he almost single-handedly was able to bring Roanoke back, and he found that he had to develop a relationship with one bank, one local bank, and go from there. That it was just like foundation funding, you have to develop a relationship and go from there. And once the first project I've done, and it was successful. The other banks got online. But he'll be the first one to tell you that it didn't work and his success in Roanoke was a community banking success. We also have one up in the balcony, David.
Hi, two questions I'd like to try to keep quick. Number one, building affordable near, the 15% of the units at 80% of the AMI. Is that enough? Do you see the best projects doing 80 to 60% AMI, or, what's that spot enough affordable around?
Okay, so this is well outside of my expertise, David, you know this more, but I will say it's always a bad idea to have like a single income, that you absolutely want to have a mix. And it's going to be different for each county, each community, and again, this is a resource and the partnership for strong communities can really help you to get that number exact. Great.
Thank you. Second question, I think in this room we'd all
agree about the pros of first-store retail, vibrancy, street activation, etc. But in my discussions in suburban contexts, developers are often reluctant to do it, not only because of the bottom line, they're afraid of cannibalism of other nearby retail, and etc. So, and even in Arlington, they put in a first-floor retail requirement, and then 10 years later looked at it again because they had a lot of vacancies. So the question is, do you feel adamant it's got to be first-floor retail all the time in these smart growth redevelopment areas, or is there some room?
No, that's what I loved about the Lancaster story on this, is because it doesn't have any excuse. It has its retail on its main street, and then like immediately behind the retail, it has its four-story housing. So it's what's called horizontal, not vertical mixed use, and it's working great. But here's the thing, when you talk about cannibalization, this is what is so important about local businesses and really supporting the local economy, that when you are putting in these developments, and we're not talking about a whole bunch of additional retail space, if you begin to figure out how to incentivize and to put in policies to put in the local businesses, it's going to grow. The local coffee shops always get so excited when Starbucks comes in to demand for a particular area, that particular product increases. So that's how I would. There was a question up in the balcony I don't want to miss.
Just a very quick question. Based on your travels and your examples, do you have any good examples of a transit-oriented redevelopment, mixed use, high density housing that has occurred in areas without public sewer infrastructure?
Yeah. I have several examples of those. The definition of high density changes a little bit. The Rhode Island Sea Grant program, as well as our office, came out with a number of resources of how to do smart growth in areas where you have no sewer. And there are a number of technologies that are available, such as package plants, et cetera, et cetera. And I don't want to get into the pros and cons. I understand it's hugely controversial, but there are a number of different ways to think strategically about how you can have that higher density smart growth without necessarily sewer. So the Rhode Island Sea Grant came out with a publication, as did our office. And it has a really long, impossible time to go to our publications and look for water from easily obvious.
Can I just add, we are putting together some meetings between the Department of Housing, Department of Public Health, Department of Energy and Environmental Protection. We're aggregating a lot of the studies that have been done. We realize it's an issue, and we are going to develop a site on our website and some forums, and we're going to get at this because we know there are a lot of towns that want to do density that don't have sewers, so we're going to try to figure that out. The other thing I would say right now, Lynn is going to stick around. If you have questions, you can stay. Does the mayor have something? Okay. We're going to give Mayor Woods the last word, but before we do that, I want you to stick around to hear Mayor Woods, because after that, I think we all need to give Lynn a round of applause. Let's give this to, not yet, let me give this to Mayor.
I'll be brief, but you heard from Mr. Brecker, who was our economic development director, who passionate, obviously, of what he does. But we realized, for Newington, we're talking about redevelopment of the National Welding site, it's a little over 4 acres. We realized early on that it was bigger than just the community of Newington, because it is right on the busway. And we have now partnered and actually hired CRDA, Capital Regional Development Authority, to oversee the demolition of that building for us. We were also very lucky to be the recipient of a $2 million brownfield grant from the state of Connecticut. So while we are not in full agreement with everything they do, we are very happy with a lot of things they do for us. And then we are also going to continue that relationship with CRDA to market that piece of property, because again, we know that it is bigger than just the town of Newington. While we want it to fit within our community and make sure that it is the right fit for it, that it extends beyond it, because it is an integral part of that busway and one of the first pieces that will be developed along that.
So a quick note, again, if you want the CM credits, sign in and leave your form. And with that, I'd like to say this wasn't exactly Bruce Springsteen. She didn't do 4 hours, but she did 2 hours and more on her feed. I think you'd agree, Lynn is spectacular. If we could clone her, we would. We're going to invite her back. In the meantime, I want to thank her, and I want to thank all of you. You guys really made it a great event. So thank you very much. She will stick around. Have a great day.